What's up folks, CrossSG back with my review on Albedo. Before we get into it though, I want to take this opportunity to welcome anyone new to the channel as well as preface this review with a few points. First, despite what you may or may not have heard, I am not actually a math guy. We already have a few awesome math guys out there who do all the good proper math deep dives with frame counting and theory crafts to the moon and back. I personally use math more as a tool to assist me in relaying information in a concise manner, doing deep dives only when absolutely necessary just to make a point. It's just easier to present, analyze and compare stuff in a neat Excel format, saying here are the numbers, this is what the math says, this is what I think of it, and here's how my tests line up with it. You can draw your own conclusions with all of this info. Next, because I use math for this purpose and in this manner, it is not possible for me to account for every single team setup, stat distribution, and playstyle in the game. And neither is it my goal to do that. I can only give my perspective based on the teams I run and gear that I have. Beyond that, all I can say is everything is dependent on your stats, team setup, and playstyle. Your mileage may vary. Lastly, if you take anything away from my videos, it should be to play the game in a manner that gives you the most enjoyment and not let the math entirely dictate how you play the game. This is a game, folks. It's not some master's or PhD course. You can never be wrong as long as you're having fun, regardless of what the math says. I will always try to provide ways and ideas to make a character work in my videos, even if the math suggests otherwise. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the review. As always, I won't be going over the basics of his kit. I'll have a link to Honey Impact in the description so you can check it out in your own time. This video is going to be long enough as it is. For this review, I'll be approaching Albedo from the perspective of both a support and a carry. I will be covering only C0 to C2 because a C2 Albedo is what I have. I'll also explore how he scales with both defense and attack based builds and of course take a look at a few of the popular weapon choices. Lastly, it's important to note that all my tests were done in the current Abyss format before the floor 9 to 12 changes. We don't yet know exactly what is going to change about the Abyss once the reset happens in a few days. Okay, let me start by saying Albedo surprised me in a good way. Those who watched my pre-launch thoughts video would know that I had my reservations about him based on the math at the time. But with the last minute buff to his E-skill upon launch, in practical use I found myself thoroughly impressed by his versatility. Let's take a quick look at my Albedo and I'll break down his main skills. This is my Albedo, he's now level 90 and these are his stats. He is currently C2, but I did a lot of testing at C0 as well, in the same gear, before unlocking C2. Breaking down his E-skill, Solar Isotoma has 3 parts to it. First, there is the initial cast damage, which scales off attack. This is largely inconsequential if you build for defense, but can deal a decent amount of damage if you build for attack. Its 4-second cooldown can make for some deceptively good damage. The second part is the persistent portion, which puts a large field on the ground, causing geo-explosions called transient blossoms whenever enemies within the field take damage. These blossom explosions scale off Albedo's defense and they can occur up to once every 2 seconds. Now there is a way to somewhat bypass this internal cooldown, but more on that later. The third part is the elevator effect. Standing on the flower in the center will lift you up into the air, and this can be repeated as long as the field is active. This mechanic can be a good or a bad thing depending on how your team is set up. I know some have found creative ways of using this to keep their paper DPS units safe from damage while still being able to bring down the damage on enemies. I personally don't like it too much though, and that's because most of my teams require me to be in the thick of it at all times, so being lifted up mid-combat can be somewhat disruptive for me. Anyway, the strength of his E-skill lies in its ability to provide extra AoE damage every 2 seconds with basically no additional user input. The field is very large and has a 4-second cooldown, so repositioning the field as required isn't an issue at all. Scaling the blossom damage off his defense is also a very good thing because Albedo's base defense is by far the highest in the game. Now on the flip side, there are a few downsides to his E-skill. The first is that half of it scales with attack, while the other half scales with defense. Now this stat confusion or split scaling extends to Albedo's entire kit at C0 because his transient blossoms make up for about half of his value and damage, whereas everything else in his kit scales off attack. It's frankly a little annoying that MiHoYo does split scaling on so many characters. It makes absolutely no sense even from a business perspective. Anyway, I digress. The second downside is that blossoms only spawn if enemies within the field take damage. This means any situation that causes you to deal no damage for any reason will not spawn any blossoms. Such situations could include enemies with elemental shields like slime or abyss mages, or actual shield-wielding enemies like hilichurls. For this reason, it's always important that your team deals with shielded enemies before anything else. The final downside is that his E-skill's energy regen is not great. His Blossom regen works very much like Zhongli's Pillar regen, where it has a chance to generate one energy particle per explosion hit regardless of how many enemies are hit by that explosion. And it is not a 100% chance to generate that particle, and this can make it feel inconsistent in some instances. That being said, this only applies to Albedo's team regen potential. He doesn't seem to have nearly as much self-regen problems as Zhongli does. I was able to maintain very decent burst uptimes with him at C0 with or without an ER weapon. Both Zhongli and Albedo have 40 energy cost bursts and they are both Geo characters. Yet throughout the disgusting amount of testing I did on Albedo, I can't provide a quantifiable explanation as to why Albedo's burst seems to come up faster than Zhongli's does in identical teams and setups. And I know I'm far from the only one who has experienced this. Again, this is at C0, so it's not because of his C1. Moving on, we have his burst, and that is a mixed bag for me. His burst deals AoE geo damage on cast and spawns 7 Fatal Blossoms if there is an Isotoma field present. Both the burst and the Fatal Blossoms scale with his attack, and I absolutely love the targeting mechanic of the initial cast portion of his burst. Unlike a variety of other units, Albedo's burst's initial hit is a hard auto target, meaning you could be facing the complete opposite direction or completely off target when casting his burst, and it seems to track and hit the nearest target regardless. Couple this with the wide AoE radius of his burst and it's almost impossible to miss with it. Now I can see how this could be annoying for some in some situations, but I personally love how it works. That being said, this is basically the only thing I like about his burst. The downsides to his burst are again, it scales with attack, not defense. And the Fatal Blossoms are spawned randomly within the Isotoma field. They don't track targets and don't converge if there are less than 7 targets within the field. Now this makes for some deceptive damage because on paper, his burst has the potential of dealing huge damage combining the initial cast portion with the Fatal Blossoms. But in practice, at least half of this damage is completely RNG. Most of the time, only 3 or 4 of the 7 blossoms actually hit something. And because the explosion radius is so small, if the targets are even somewhat spaced out, very often each individual target only receives damage from 1 or 2 out of the 7 blossoms. It's literally a spray and pray scenario, and this can cause folks to think that his burst does more damage than it actually does in practice. Anyway, you'll see what I mean when we get to the calculations later. Now onto his constellations, and C1 provides 1.2 energy every time a blossom is procced. Now this regen does not seem to be affected by energy recharge, and contrary to what some have claimed, I spent about 20 minutes bullying the same Ruin Guard over and over again, and my conclusion is that it definitely occurs while Albedo is off-field as well. Looking at his C2, and as many have confirmed, unfortunately it only affects his burst and Fatal Blossom damage. I had originally hoped that it would scale with his entire kit because I thought it would give him what I felt at the time was a much needed damage boost. As it turns out, after testing him extensively, I don't think he needed all that much of a boost to do well, and the damage boost just to his burst and Fatal Blossom is more than sufficient. That being said, because of this, his C2 merely improves his scaling. It doesn't actually solve his scaling problems entirely. Anyway, how it works is every time a blossom is procced, you gain 1 charge of the buff. These charges are indicated by a small flower icon that floats around the currently active character. Yes, this of course means that the buff can stack whilst Albedo is off-field. When fully stacked, using Albedo's Burst and Fatal Blossoms would grant it 120% of his defense as additional damage. Alright, so how did Albedo fare in my tests? The short answer is spectacularly well. But you aren't here for the short answer, so let's dig a little deeper. As a support unit, Albedo brings a few things to the table. He brings very strong sustained DPS via his Transient Blossom autoprocs, a nice team EM buff, and decent burst damage if built specifically for it. If there is one word I can use to describe him in the support role, it would be lazy mode. You drop his E skill, go about your business, extra damage magically appears along the way, his burst comes up, swap back to him, drop his E skill, use his burst, rinse and repeat. That's basically how you use Albedo as a support in practically any team, and this is one of the core strengths of Albedo. He works with a lot of teams. Of course, this isn't to say he is the best in slot for every team, but he will generally bring decent value to most teams that you put him in. Now, the teams I personally tested him in as a support were my Noelle, Razor, Xinyan, and Ningguang carry teams, and he performed well on these teams across the board. Though if I had to rank the teams specifically, I'd say he did best in my Razor and Ningguang teams. How I came to this conclusion is simple. I just compared Albedo to any other support that I could potentially run in those teams. In my Noelle team, I concluded that there were many equally if not more viable options in that position compared to Albedo, namely Zhongli or Ningguang. Noelle's strength is her AoE damage potential, so adding more AoE damage via Albedo's Blossom procs, while great for mobbing, doesn't exactly bring balance to her team. He just can't replace the hard CC that Zhongli brings or the sheer energy regen and single target DPS that Ningguang brings. Now in my Xinyan team, Fischl and Diona are mainstays for superconduct and heals, and I feel having Xingqiu or Bennett in the team just brings more value than Albedo. Now this was admittedly a little surprising because I had pegged Albedo as a very good support unit for Xinyan, filling the long downtimes between her E and burst skills with extra damage. He does do the job decently well, but I just feel Xingqiu or Bennett bring more value. Onto my Razor team, and Albedo basically only had to contend with Fischl for this position. And as an off-field DPS support unit, he completely knocked it out of the park. 30-second field duration, 2-second auto procs of 10k plus damage with AoE hit potential. A burst that actually deals damage versus Fischl's burst, which exists pretty much to just bring Oz back onto the field. Overall, it looks like he'll be the mainstay on my Razor team. And finally, we have my Ningguang team, and Albedo works by providing what Ningguang lacks: reliable AoE damage. Any Ningguang main is familiar with the quirks surrounding her targeting mechanics, and having Albedo on the team just makes it a lot easier to lay down consistent damage with Ningguang as the carry. Once I got used to positioning her Jade Screen so it doesn't break itself on Albedo's Isotoma, I had little trouble clearing all 3 chambers of floor 12 at a very decent pace with just my level 17 Ningguang. Alright, that's it for support. Let's take a look at Albedo as a carry, and full disclosure, I didn't test him in this role at C0, and that's largely my own fault. Based on how the math looked and how he played as a support, I didn't even think to test him as a carry at C0, assuming he just wouldn't do all that well. Once I got done with all my C0 support tests, I quickly unlocked C2 to begin C2 testing, and it was only after concluding my C2 support test that I gave him a run as a carry. Now remember how I said in my first impression videos that I saw a sliver of carry potential with him at C2? Well, as it turns out, he does indeed work as a carry, in my specific setups at least. I tested him first with Zhongli, Xiangling, and Diona, and things went very well. I was able to clear the first halves of all 3 chambers of floor 12 in 9-star fashion, and cleared chamber 3 in about 1 minute 18 seconds. Now with both Zhongli and Albedo on the same team, their energy regen is really good. I had no issues getting both of their bursts up on cooldown, and the rotation was more reminiscent of a quick swap team rather than a straight up Albedo carry team. The second team I tested him in was with Xingqiu, Xiangling, and Diona, basically swapping Zhongli for Xingqiu. And well, I guess you could say that he did more than okay, proceeding to clear both halves of all 3 chambers of floor 12 with faster times for the most part than even my Noelle regen burst team. And those who have followed my channel for a while would know that my Noelle regen team is my fastest clearing team to date by a pretty large margin. Well, technically, Albedo did poach Xiangling from my Noelle team to do this, but subbing in Xinyan as the Pyro on Noelle's team still worked well enough for me to get 9-star clears nonetheless. Now if you are surprised by this, so was I. Everything pointed to Albedo not being terribly viable as a carry. His kit has massive stat confusion, his normal attacks have very low modifiers, and his C2 only affects his burst. But somehow in practice, he just worked out, and this isn't so much a result of his personal DPS potential. It's decent, but not spectacular. Rather, Albedo's strength here lies in his ability to harness, enable, and improve your team's overall damage output in a manner that isn't so easily quantifiable on paper. In a way, he kinda serves the same function as my Noelle does in her regen team. They are both the characters that anchor their respective teams. I spend most of the time with them on the field, but they aren't necessarily the ones dealing majority of the damage. Perhaps in these specific setups, calling them the carries isn't the most accurate description. I've always defined the carry as the one who spends the most time on the field and deals majority of the damage. So what would you call something like this? Just the tank? I don't know, maybe someone has or will come up with a more appropriate term for this. Now quickly going over Albedo's carry rotation, the lazy way would be to simply use his E-skill on cooldown and use his burst whenever it comes up, spamming normal attacks in between. There is however a way to squeeze out a little more damage from his rotation, and that's with strategic use of his E-skill. As a few have already discovered, casting his E-skill resets the internal cooldown of his transient blossom procs. What this basically means is if you wait till you get a blossom proc and use his E-skill immediately after that, the next hit following this will proc a blossom as well, bypassing the 2-second internal cooldown. Now this would of course require you to delay your E-skill use slightly to about 5 seconds instead of using it on its 4-second cooldown. But doing so could not only give you up to 15 to 20% more blossom DPS over a given period, but it can also give you a bit more control over the procs to provide some spike damage potential. Now this is ultimately a minor detail, but one worth considering if you really want to min-max your rotation with Albedo as a carry. Alright, let's talk about Albedo's build options, and there are two options in general. You either want to go full DPS defense or full DPS attack. At C0, both work well, and I did test Albedo in both builds, but found that the defense build suited my playstyle more. Now the main difference between the two builds is where the damage comes from. In a defense build, your damage would largely come from his Transient Blossom auto procs, whereas in an attack build, your damage is skewed much more towards his burst. Now a full attack build does require a little bit more user input, and the damage source is different, so it might require different artifacts, so it's really up to you to decide which build suits your playstyle more. Now speaking of artifacts, Albedo is pretty flexible about artifact choices in a defense build. You basically want 2-piece Petra, and anything basically goes from there. You can go with 2-piece Gamblers or 2-piece Defender's Will to gain the set bonuses that buff the Transient Blossom damage. Or you could go with 4-piece Petra, or just random 5-star pieces for pure stat increases. Yes, in my calculations, going with 2-piece Defender's Will or 2-piece Gamblers could result in slightly more damage, but it involves just as much RNG as putting together any decent set of 5-star artifacts. The bottom line is, the differences aren't huge, so go with 2-piece Petras followed by whatever else gives you the best stats. Now if you have Albedo at C2, things start getting skewed more heavily toward the defense build in general. But it's important to note that his initial burst damage will still eventually scale better with attack, somewhere over 2400 attack, depending on your talent level, but the real kicker here is not the initial damage of his burst, it is the damage from his fatal blossoms. As I've mentioned a few times in previous videos, damage scaling in this manner affects smaller damage sources more than larger ones, because it essentially adds a flat value to all applicable attacks. Thus, this 120% scaling increases his Fatal Blossom damage proportionally more than it does his burst, causing Fatal Blossoms to deal comparable damage in a full defense build at C2, even when compared to a 3000 attack build with an R5 Summit Shaper. And this ultimately leads me to conclude that defense is generally the better way to build Albedo at C2 regardless of what role you have him in. You deal less damage with the first half of his burst, but it has an easier rotation and much more consistent damage output. Now speaking of the Summit Shaper, let's take a look at his weapon choices. There are 3 primary weapons that pop up in discussion when it comes to Albedo, but to be completely honest, I personally only consider 2 of them to be worth looking at. But for the sake of this review, I'll be exploring all 3 of them. First up, we have the 3-star Harbinger of Dawn. The strength of this weapon lies in the sheer amount of crit rate and crit damage it brings. This can outweigh the increases in base attack as well as weapon bonuses granted by other weapon options because crit stats apply to his entire kit. The fact that Albedo's Transient Blossom scales with his defense further adds to the value of this weapon because the low base attack doesn't matter for scaling Transient Blossom damage. Now of course the primary downside of this weapon is that you need to maintain Albedo's HP above 90% or you lose the 28% crit rate bonus. Now this is something constantly harped on by many in the community and it's frankly a rather misguided view of the weapon in my opinion. First, this weapon gives 2 things, crit rate and crit damage. The only part you lose from dropping below 90% HP is the crit rate. You still retain the crit damage and over 40% crit damage is not an insignificant amount. Simply put, if you chose to somehow build your Albedo to rely solely on the Harbinger bonus for all of your crit rate and can't reliably keep yourself above 90% HP, the problem here is really not the weapon. On that note, it is very possible to keep Albedo over 90% HP regardless of what role you have him in. There are really only 2 scenarios where you'll have a definitive problem with this. A is if you run Bennett as your healer, or B is if you don't run a healer at all. Now outside of these 2 scenarios, it really comes down to how your teams are set up and how attentive you are to Albedo's HP pool. All of the clips I've shown so far in this video are with me using the Harbinger of Dawn. As you can see, I personally have no problems maintaining over 90% HP almost 100% of the time. The bottom line is, if you aren't confident of keeping this buff up, don't sweat it, just use the next weapon on this list. And speaking of the next weapon, we have the 4-star Festering Desire. Its strengths are that it's free, much cheaper to enhance to level 90 at the moment, and we will eventually get it to max refine from the Dragonspine campaign. Now its bonus scales Albedo's Transient Blossom damage quite well, and it also comes with ER as a secondary stat, which can help if you have problems with energy regen. Now the downside to this is that its bonus only applies to Albedo's E skill and nothing else. However, I wouldn't necessarily consider this a downside because it does boost what I feel is the most significant portion of Albedo's kit. And finally we have the current 5-star banner sword, the Summit Shaper. And if you haven't guessed it by now, this is the option that I don't think should be considered for Albedo unless you have a couple of $1,000 lying around looking to be spent. To be clear, I'm not saying an R5 Summit Shaper doesn't work with Albedo. What I'm saying is that for the amount of money it costs to get it, it scales so poorly with Albedo's overall damage compared to the first 2 options that I just don't think it's worth it. Okay, spreadsheet time. Let's take a look at how the weapons rank for each specific build. I'll timestamp this part so you can skip to the results if you want. Here's my entire Albedo math table in all its glory. Don't worry, I'll work the magic as we go along to make things much easier to understand. I just wanted to show you how I did all the calculations. On the left we have all the calculations for a full defense build, and on the right we have the calculations for a full attack build. Unlike some of my other videos where I had to mathematically approximate some of the comparisons, I actually own well-optimized full defense and full attack artifact sets for Albedo, so I use the exact stats that I have in each build for the calculations. Here we have all the skill multipliers using level 8 skills, with the C2 defense scaling value and the enemy mitigation. As mentioned earlier, I usually only do damage per hit calculations rather than DPS calculations because DPS calculation just takes too much work and provides information that is way more specific than I feel is required for my purposes. However, because Albedo's kit is heavily cooldown or internal cooldown dependent, getting an approximate DPS value for most of his damage sources is actually somewhat possible. Yes, I know this isn't going to be 100% accurate, but 100% accuracy isn't the goal here. The name of the game is general ballpark figures. That's all the specificity we need for the points I'm looking to get across. Anyway, the large table below are the damage per hit calculations for each of his skills with each weapon in each build. And over at the bottom, we have his DPS values. Now we don't need this anymore, so let's hide that. Okay, lots of numbers here, and I just want to draw your attention to a few key points. These are the cooldowns I use for each skill with respect to each weapon. I got a ton of comments in my last video asking me to take energy recharge into consideration, so that's what I did. I assumed that we have 100% burst uptime with the Festering Desire, as you can see, 12 seconds. None of the other weapons have energy recharge, so I increased the cooldowns of these weapons proportional to the missing energy recharge. Why 19 seconds for the Summit Shaper, you ask? That's because I factored in the maximum stacks of its buff in the sheet attack. So naturally, we have to account for the time it actually takes to stack it. Yes, 1.5 seconds is the bare minimum and it probably takes closer to 3 seconds. But again, ballpark figures folks, we need to compromise between generalization and specificity here. Next we have this 3.5 value. This refers to the average number of fatal blossoms that hit a single target every burst cycle. As explained earlier, it is extremely rare that all 7 blossoms will hit the same target, so I think a very fair average hit count assumption per target would be half of that. And finally, you will notice that the cooldowns at C2 are all 12 seconds, with the necessary 1.5 second addition for the Summit Shaper. Now this is because C1 pretty much guarantees full uptime regardless of the weapon. Okay, let's get rid of all the unnecessary stuff. These are the final DPS figures and how the weapons rank for each build. These red percentages indicate how much less DPS a weapon provides compared to the top weapon for that build, and the percentage in the middle indicates the DPS difference between the top weapons in respective builds. As a C0 full defense support unit, we have the Harbinger of Dawn up top, followed by the Festering Desire, then the R5 Summit Shaper, and lastly the R1 Summit Shaper. Again, we're looking at a larger margin of error here than normal, so really I'd consider a difference of even 5% negligible. This puts both the Harbinger of Dawn and the Festering Desire within reach of one another for this build. As a C0 full attack support unit, we have the Festering Desire first, followed by the Harbinger of Dawn, then the R5 Summit Shaper, and finally the R1 Summit Shaper. Again, negligible difference between both the Harbinger and the Festering Desire. As a C2 full defense support unit, we see the Harbinger at the top by a large margin, followed by the R5 Summit Shaper, then the Festering Desire, and lastly the R1 Summit Shaper. Now this comes down to C2 scaling defense into Albedo's burst and the fact that the Harbinger's crit stats affect his entire kit. As a C2 full attack support, again we have the Harbinger on top, followed by the R5 Summit Shaper, then the R1 Summit Shaper, and lastly the Festering Desire. Moving on, we have the carry builds. As a C2 full defense carry, we have the R5 Summit Shaper on top, followed by the Harbinger of Dawn, then the R1 Summit Shaper, and lastly the Festering Desire. And as a C2 full attack carry, we have the R5 Summit Shaper up top, followed by the R1 Summit Shaper, followed by the Harbinger of Dawn, and the Festering Desire. Now comparing defense and attack builds with one another, we see that at C0 a full defense support build tops out at about 15% more DPS than a full attack support build. At C2, a full defense support build does about 18% more DPS than a full attack build. And finally, for the C2 carry builds, we barely see any difference between the two builds. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? It should be pretty obvious now why I feel the Summit Shaper is entirely not worth the money. It brings less practical DPS than the Harbinger of Dawn in all support builds, and just a paltry 7% and 12% more DPS in defense and attack carry builds respectively. That's horrible value for the ridiculous amount of money you need to spend to get an R5 Summit Shaper, and even if you do get a rank 1 by sheer luck, it's only 3% better in only one build, and 3% is within margins of error. But Crush, I noticed that your crit rate is terribly low for the Summit Shaper builds. Doesn't this skew the results towards the Harbinger of Dawn? Yes it does, but not as much as you think. Of course I did the calculations for that too. Here's what it looks like with full 1:2 golden ratio crit optimization across all builds. The results are basically identical, folks. For those who are shocked as to why this is the case, the explanation is simple. Albedo's burst scales with attack, but it is not nearly as heavy hitting as many think it is. 50k damage once every 12 seconds pales in comparison to his transient blossom damage in a full defense build. And the fact that his fatal blossoms spawn randomly and almost never converge on a single target further hurts the value of his burst, and by way of that hurts the value of any attack based build. That being said, do keep in mind that even though the Festering Desire didn't seem to rank well in some of these builds, I do believe that the Harbinger and Festering Desire are two of the best weapons for Albedo in general, especially at C0. These two swords come very close in DPS output. Alright folks, that's about everything I tested for Albedo. Let's go over my thoughts and conclusions. I think Albedo is an excellent 5-star unit. His kit is extremely versatile and he can be run as a support in a large variety of teams. He also seems to be a very viable carry at C2, but this is very dependent on your team composition. One of his primary advantages lies in the low elemental strength of his Blossom procs. This allows teams to benefit from the bonus Blossom damage without actually having to worry about Crystallize wiping elements from the enemies, and this makes Albedo uniquely qualified to be put on certain reaction-heavy teams. He also has good synergy with many units, and the best synergy is probably tied between Zhongli and Ningguang, though I'd personally say he does better with Ningguang over Zhongli. Now, as mentioned earlier, Albedo's best weapons are between a free 4-star and a 3-star, and he brings almost all of his support value at just C0. Now this, coupled with the fact that his transient blossom scale with his defense, makes him a comparatively low investment 5-star unit to build for, and therefore surprisingly free to play or low spending friendly, despite having issues with split scaling. His performance on floor 12 of the Abyss shows that he is more than capable at the late game and will scale well at least up to the current content we have available to us at the moment. The upcoming Abyss change looks set to make things potentially easier for Geo units on floor 12, and the tentative Geo element and Zhongli buffs coming in 1.3 do seem to paint a very optimistic picture for Geo units on a whole, further adding to Albedo's value. However, there's a small caveat to all of this, and it comes down to the same problem Noelle has. Where other units are limited by weapons and equipment, units like Noelle and the Defense Albedo are limited by their base defense, and there is currently no way to increase it other than character level. This is one of those situations where you unlock his full base potential up front, but what you see is all you're gonna get unless they decide to increase the level cap. Of course, this is currently sufficient because Albedo's level 90 base defense is 876, and that is relatively competitive with the highest base attacks attainable by some 5-star units with 5-star weapons. But who knows what the future holds. Anyway, that's just food for thought. We could very well get a defense-oriented 4 or 5-star sword down the road, and with the upcoming 5-star weapons allegedly rocking crit rate as their secondaries, things could get very interesting depending on their bonuses. All that being said, I personally place a lot of value in versatility because a versatile unit is one that you largely only have to build once to possibly serve many roles or functions. This reason alone brings more value to me than buying into some meta unit. Strictly in my opinion, of course. The meta can shift at the drop of a dime. Thus, all things considered, I'd say that Albedo is indeed worth considering if you fall into the following category of player. First, you need to have enough Primogem saved up to hit the pity, and you also need to be guaranteed Albedo on that pity. Second, you need to already have decent carries in your team and not be currently saving up for any specific unit like Xiao or Ganyu. And lastly, and this is an important one, you must like Albedo's design as a character and understand that besides Ningguang, the Geo element is not about big PP damage. Most of the Geo units, Albedo included, seem to be support units by design. Ultimately, all I can offer is one man's opinion. It is largely anecdotal and subjective, so you gotta make the final pool decision on your own. And that brings us to the end of my Albedo review, folks. Thanks for watching. As always, thumbs up if you liked it, down if you didn't, crush that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.